Welcome, everybody. My name is Terry Swartz-Russell, and I am Director of Family and Adult Education at Temple Emmanuel. And it's wonderful to see so many people coming out who are interested in Israeli literature. I just want to go through a few housekeeping things. We're going to ask everybody to remain on mute while our speaker, Dr. Nancy Berg, speaks. She will share her presentation with us. While she's doing that, you are more than welcome to put any questions in the chat, which we'll be monitoring. And after her presentation, we'll have time for Q&A. I just want to thank a couple of people. One is Sigalit Davis, who is going to introduce our speaker in a minute, who brought us Nancy. And also, but the impetus for this whole thing was that Paula Apsel went to a class with Rachel Corazin, am I correct? And decided that she wanted to read Israeli novels in English, and sent out an email, and poof, there were two groups of people of Temple Manual members reading Israeli novels. She'll tell us more later. But in the interest of time, I will turn it over now to Sigalit, and she will introduce Nancy. Thank you.
Erev Tov, good evening, everyone. Oh, am I? Yeah, I'm
You are.
okay. Yeah. You hear me?
Yep.
Okay, great. So it is my privilege to introduce Nancy Berg to this evening. Nancy is a professor of Hebrew and comparative literature at Washington University in St. Louis, Missouri. She has been a fellow to the Center for Arabic Studies Abroad at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem and the Herbert Katz Center for Advanced Jewish Studies at the University of Pennsylvania. Those of you who are team members, you've seen the lecture series coming through the messages. She previously served as the president of the National Association of Professors of Hebrew in North America as well. Nancy co-edited the National Jewish Book Award for Anthology and Collections called What We Talk About When We Talk About Hebrew and What It Means to Americans. Many of you might have seen this book. Her forthcoming book is the title of the lecture today. Since 1948, Israeli Literature in the Making. I'm looking forward, Nancy, to hear about your research and insights and your creative explanation of the portrait of Israeli literature as a transnational, multilingual, and worthy of international attention. Thank you for being here, and I think we're ready. I will say that Paula wanted to read them in English, and I challenged her for Hebrew, and everybody is taking Hebrew with me to prepare to read these novels in Hebrew.
That's next year.
That's the goal.
That's great.
And those of you who are not engaged yet, we welcome you to the Hebrew courses so you can take the journey with us. So Nancy, welcome and thank you for being here tonight.
Well, and thank you very much, Sigalit and Terry and everyone. I do appreciate it. And it's nice to be back in, the Boston area, even if it's only virtually. As my daughter said, oh, the old country. So, because I came from next door. But now I come from the field of literature, which I chose, or maybe which chose me many years ago, in large part because of my love of stories. And so I want to start with a story that opens the book, what we talk about when we talk about Hebrew and what it means to Americans. And by the way, for those of you who write, never choose a long title for your book. And I think of a talk, especially a talk that takes place around the dinner hour, as a kind of meal. So this is like an amuse-bouche, the story. A number of years ago, I was in Texas for a conference, and it was actually an NAPH, a National Association of Professors of Hebrew conference. And I went out with a few colleagues, all of whom were Israeli, and we were discussing our plans for the evening in the back of a cab. And the driver was an immigrant from Ghana, and he Unable to contain his curiosity, he asked us what language we were speaking. Hebrew, we answered. And he looked confused. And so one of us said, like in the Bible. And I could see that he was picturing us. Oh, and I've forgotten my presentation. Sorry. Oh, wait, I have to screen share. I'm not a professional at this either. How do I share this? Desktop. So share. I am sorry, this is not coming up, is it? Now it is, right? So this is the book?
Yes, it's here.
And I just ruined my anecdote, but I could see he was picturing us, like he said Hebrew, like in the Bible, and we were characters, as if we were characters from the Old Testament, having left our camels at the well. And so his reaction to us reminded me what an extraordinary feat the revival of Hebrew is, to take a language that lay virtually dormant for 2,000 years and turn it into the mother tongue of millions, the shared vernacular for immigrants from many countries, a source of national identity and fount of cultural achievement. The revival of the Hebrew language in the 19th and 20th centuries was improbable, unprecedented, and, at least as of our time, unreplicated. And I want to share my enthusiasm for the language and its backstory and illustrate some of its richness through examples from literature, and even consider what a talking fish might have to say. And I understand that there are several lectures this month about the revival of Hebrew, and one of them was about an hour ago. So I'm not the Gilad Zuckerman lecture. I don't know how many of you were there, but I'm not going to spend too much time on the topic unless it comes up in the Q&A. And I'm going to say more about the second book, my second collaboration with the same colleague, Naomi Sokolov, which is since 1948, Israeli literature in the making. And, okay. And this book actually has recently come out. So anybody who wants to buy it, look for the 50% off sale because it's hardback. Naomi and I saw the project as an opportunity to re-examine, reassess, and celebrate Israeli literature. We figured we could reclaim the overlooked, the misread, the undervalued, as well as reread and reconsider great works. And so we gathered together, a dozen of us, and we carefully tried to balance between all different categories, age and gender and status in the profession, experience, education, nationality, and offer a range of different perspectives, topics, and approaches. So we can't cover everything in the book, but we thought that through a dozen snapshots, people would get a taste of Israeli literature today, Israeli literature over the past 70 plus years, and a taste of the different ways we approach the study of Israeli literature. And only after the two books came out, we realized how much they talk to each other. The first is about Hebrew in America, what it means for us to be Hebrew scholars and teachers and enthusiasts here in the States. The second, obviously, about Israeli literature. The dialogue comes in large part because of the internal tensions and contradictions, because Hebrew and Israeli overlap, but not perfectly. Rather, it's messy, exciting, and dynamic. And here you see Hebrew Israeli literature, and they're not entirely separate, but they're also not entirely the same thing. The great poet and comparatist Leah Goldberg declared, quote, "No academy has ever built a language. Language is created by people and by the best writers and poets." It was in literature that the language was forced to stretch and bend, and it's from the literature that the spoken idiom emerged. An idiom that is now the mother tongue and primary language of several million people, a language that has produced an extraordinary literature with a great deal of ordinary works too, in a relatively short time. It's religious and secular, refined and profane, canonical and marginal, lush and spare. Israel also claims the highest per capita book buying population and the second highest per capita publishing of books. So people of the book indeed. While the marketplace is full of works translated to Hebrew from many languages, translations are now outsold by original Hebrew literature. And so I want to talk a little bit about what we see Israeli literature to be. And the first is my language bubbles. And if you can see, Arabic is kind of covered by our pictures, I think. But Israeli literature is written in Hebrew, as well as Arabic and Yiddish and English and Russian and other languages. So when we talk about Hebrew literature, Israeli literature, it's not an exact match. So too, Israeli literature is being written mostly in Israel, but also in the US and Germany and other places. And Israeli literature deals with Israeli topics and characters, but also universal topics and non-Israeli topics and non-Israeli main characters. And so to get a grip of what Israeli literature is maybe a little bit like trying to, grab onto a fish. In our book since 1948, there are perhaps not unsurprisingly a number of essays that center on the question of language. And that's a little word blurb. Don't bother reading it. It just gives you an idea of the book. And one paper in the book focuses on the way the Hebrew of the story expresses the Arabic that some of the characters speak. It's a close reading of an early short story by a writer who identified with the Canaanite movement. And that movement was small in numbers, but has had influence beyond its size because so many of its adherents were intellectuals, writers, and artists. The movement rooted Hebrew identity with the ancient land of Canaan and separated it from Judaism and separated it from Zionism. Hebrew is seen as the language of the land, not of any religion or political movement. And in paging through the collection, in preparing for this talk, it struck me how this essay by Yael Dekel is in conversation with the piece by Wendy Zerler that looks at the use of poetry by secular Israelis in the Sidurim, in the prayer books of conservative and Reform Jews in America. The first piece chronicles the break between Hebrew and Jewish. The second is sort of a reunion of the two. Another article in our book uses Hebrew as a way of masking. Eric Zakim introduced many of us to some of the pulp fiction in the 1960s. The covers featured illustrations lifted from other books. They promised a great deal more titillation than they actually delivered. The prose is more tame than the cover. These cheap paperbacks were so far from the ideals of Zionism and highbrow Hebrew culture that they were actually presented as imports. The authors were hidden behind pen names that sounded American or British, and the title pages proclaimed the works translated from the English, even though they were originally written in Hebrew. It was a false translation. They were even mistakenly cataloged as such in the Israel National Library. While several essays in our book focus on the Israeli literature written in other languages or in or about other places outside of Israel, I want to turn our attention to three different works that were all originally written in Hebrew. And I have to admit the connection among the three of them is somewhat tenuous. You might even say kind of fishy. But let me see if I can hook you. The first is the deservedly celebrated tour de force by David Grossman, Ayin Erech Ahava, See Under Love, which some of you may know, and I'm going to recommend it for your group. The book is remarkable for a number of reasons. It's the first example I know of a second-generation Holocaust novel written by an Israeli, and an Israeli who's not actually the child of survivors. More significantly, each of its 4 parts stretches the genre of novel and the language of Hebrew in new and extraordinary directions. Each section grapples with the issue of writing about that which can't be written about the inadequacies of language. Each section proposes a different solution and a different virtuosic use of Hebrew. Together, they create a new world and a new language. While the first section, about a young boy's attempt to capture and subdue the Nazi beast, is the most well-known, it's the second section that I want to talk about. And this is a counterfactual imagining of the fate of Bruno Schulz, who was a Polish Jewish writer. He was known to have been shot by an SS officer during the Holocaust. It was horrible, obviously a horrible traumatic event in a series or a huge traumatic event. But Grossman imagines that he's still alive. He redeems him from his brutal death and imagines that he, Bruno Schulz, escaped to the sea, and that gradually he himself becomes a fish. And let me quote the passage. I think even in the English, it has a lot of its power. Bruno swims on, his head immersed in the water. He no longer needs to breathe the air outside. He gazes down at the abyss. The waves have ground the lenses of his eyes till they are marvelously suited to the underwater vision. And objects now appear wavy, their colors breaking and winding to reveal the threads of 1,000 subtle hues embroidered there and splitting on the waves, which pluck themselves like a harp made of water strings on the giant cradle marking sea time. And also a hand can leave a print on a wave where it no longer is, where it never was. And maybe a wave will carry the body's image away, and when it returns, carry it back. The outlines of soft Pacific objects giving into the soothing waves, to the slumberous sea breathing slippery sleep on the lip of the reef, and the pages of dreams, and so forth. I hope you can hear the poetry in that even in translation, the style of the writing is lush and exuberant and even tumultuous. The passage itself is a fantasy. The sea is also a character welcoming Bruno, the writer turned fish. And there are many layers here, a confusion of layers. After all, this book is a story of many writers, one in the present trying to commune with one from the past, one where we have both the fictional life of a real writer and the real life of a fictional writer, as well as what they write. At the outset, the narrator imagines the writer, Bruno, looking for the medium in which to write, abandoning the known language. A new grammar and a new calligraphy had to be invented, he says. Each level, each writer, the writers within the story, the writers of the stories, they each struggle with finding the right language to use, whether inventing or discovering. And every layer of language, the language the sea uses to communicate with both Bruno and his chronicler, the language of Bruno's writing, the language of the narrator's writing, is represented in Hebrew. Here it is lyrical, the rhythm evoking that of the waves of the sea. On one hand, Grossman is seeking the solution to an impossible task, to write about the Holocaust. On the other, he's challenging the limits of the Hebrew revival, proving Dante right, that Hebrew is indeed the language of grace. I first read that line of Dante's, that Hebrew is the language of grace, in an essay by Anton Shammas. The same year that Grossman published See Under Love, Shammas published his great work, Arabesques. In some ways, the two books are similar, both meriting the huge attention they received, both working on multiple levels, both confusing the lines between autobiography and fiction, and both lauded for their masterful use of Hebrew. In other ways, they couldn't be more different. Arabesques became best known for its authorship. It was celebrated as the first Hebrew novel by an Arab author. As an aside, it actually wasn't, but no matter. It was the first that was well known. Over the past generation, quite a few Arabs have been known for their writing in Hebrew, including Naim Araidi, Ayman Siksek, and the incomparable Said Kashua. But here, I want to introduce you to the poet Ayat Abu Shumais. And now in her mid-30s, Abu Shumais published her first poem 10 years ago, her first collection in 2013, and her second a couple of years ago. She grew up in and still lives in Jaffa, educated in the French school quadrilingually, in French, in Hebrew, in Arabic, and in English. I read somewhere that her mother never learned to read, and as such insisted that her daughter get the best education possible. Ayat Abu Shumais married young and had her first and only child at 18. When she began writing, she began in Hebrew. An observant Muslim, for her, Arabic is the language of the Quran and not a language for personal expression. On the website Politically Correct, she's posted a statement why she writes in Hebrew, and I'll quote from it. When I began writing as a teenager, I began in Hebrew and a little in English. I never wrote a poem in Arabic. It's odd to me now that I'm saying it because Arabic is my mother tongue. When I began to write, I got mostly positive feedback. I don't remember that anyone asked me then why I wrote in a language that wasn't mine. After I began to publish, the meaning of writing in Hebrew slowly dawned on me. And when I was asked by a journalist if writing in Hebrew was like sleeping with the enemy, I realized that it is in essence the language of the conqueror, the enemy. I continued to write, exposed to different reactions, but I was always asked why I write in a language that isn't my mother tongue. I explained that it was for technical reasons, since I don't know to write well in Arabic. I also feel very comfortable writing in a language I love, and I don't apologize for that. At this point, it is 8 years since the publication of my first poem, and I still get the same reactions. I don't always explain the reasons. Sometimes I can't be bothered to repeat the same things. And sometimes it seems that people insist on distinction and differences between us, and even more so, insist on hostile relations. I just continue on my own. In an article about her titled "My Identity Has Nothing to Do with the Language in Which I Write," she has stated, "When I write in Hebrew, I feel at home." And even as she emphasizes the pragmatic aspect of writing in Hebrew, she is kept aware of her anomalousness and her status as a linguistic guest, or if you permit, a linguist. Subject to repeated queries, the issue of language becomes fodder for her writing. And here's her poem in English. I haul the words that I haven't learned yet. My language is drowning. Two storms like the sea in winter. I can't capture even one word in my palate. Raising the voice like a fish hook, my tongue carrying a basket filled with tongues mute as fish, and I place them on the counter in your kitchen. Her writing is very direct, using simple diction and structures. She writes about her life, her neighborhood, about her identity, and more from a place of political engagement. She has also come to understand that the personal is political, and her verse shows her beginning to find her footing as a feminist. Here's a short poem. I did not finish proving to you that I am good, that I am a woman, that I am an artist. I still have something to prove. Stay a little longer. Ayat Abu Shumais has enlarged her footprint with presence on social media and has joined forces with the Ars Poetica movement led by Adi Kesar, perhaps the most influential literary movement in Israeli literature today. Her forceful poetry happens to be written in Hebrew. While there are layers of meaning to the accident of language, and the poet does not hesitate to exploit many of them, the phenomenon of language choice does not define her or her poetry. And yet the language in which she writes does have some effect on what and how she writes. She's very aware of her audience. And because she writes in Hebrew, she's reluctant to write anything that exposes her community, a conservative Muslim community, to criticism or censure by Jewish readers. Having been brought up never to discuss religion or politics, she skirts around the topics, even as she has become more political and more overtly feminist. Hebrew both limits and liberates her. As she says, there are things I am comfortable writing in Hebrew with the understanding and the intention that it is directed to a Jewish audience, topics that I would be embarrassed to talk about in my mother tongue, like intimacy, for example. End quote. So now to the third example. One of the most successful writers in Israel, Etgar Keret, has also been called one of Israel's hippest writers. The seeming simplicity of his stories, written in the language from the street and using nearly every phrase and structure that we Hebrew teachers try to teach against, belie a sophistication, complexity, and yes, artistry. Keret builds on apparently insignificant details, ideas, and plot kernels that could be too easily dismissed by an impatient reader, holding up Israeli society and sometimes humanity in general to close scrutiny and loving criticism. He's collaborated in many media, from Entebbe the musical to films and graphic novels, but he's best known for his short stories, in which he combines a reverence for the quotidian, the everyday, with a natural genius for the quirky. Keret's stories are populated with characters such as an ideologically motivated bus driver, watermelon hunters armed with bandoliers of feta cheese, a father who runs away to the circus, and Kurt Cobain. At the heart of his stories are relationships between parents and children, kids and pets, men and women. In his own way, Keret, the author of a novella about the dismal world of suicides, is an incurable optimist and a true romantic. The story I want to tell you about is titled Halibut. It's a simple story, maybe 4 pages long. On the surface, not much happens. 2 friends meet for lunch, so one can tell the other the news that he's engaged. They spar at the table when the narrator questions the waitress about his dish. And the one with the news, the recently engaged friend, Ari, he leaves abruptly. As short and as simple as the story is, it works on several levels and has a number of facets. I'll just offer you 3, maybe 4. Economy, friendship, and fantasy. So this is a story of economics. The narrator, who's also our protagonist, tells us that the economy is in recession. Ari, his friend, sees recession as opportunity. For the rich, it is free upgrades. Quote, and just like that, he says, Johnny Walker goes from red label to black. End quote. There are references to the stock market and its downturn. The narrator repeatedly mentions his own business commitments. There's discussion over who pays for the meal, including the gestures of reaching for a wallet, letting go. The final bill is discounted the price of an entree, which is 45 shekels, about $12.50. The economy serves as a backdrop for the narrator's unease. It functions as both an element of realism and a metaphor for decline and disenchantment. So that's reading 1. This is also a story that explores male friendship, and these I think are pretty rare. The narrative suggests a fraying in the friendship. Even those lunches with Ari that used to light up my days are a drag, says our protagonist. It isn't so much that Ari's romance has eclipsed their friendship as much as the narrator's implicit criticism of his friend. Because you see, the story reveals that Ari is kind of a jerk. He's the one, if you remember, he's the one that sees the recession as an opportunity to enjoy luxury at a bargain. And as it unfolds, the narrator seems to become more aware of his friend's inherent jerkiness. For example, there's the nickname that Ari gave his fiance named Nessia. And he's inordinately proud of renaming her NASDAQ after the stock market. Not only is it an odd name to give to the love of one's life, but it is problematic in terms of the economic downturn in which the story is set. Quote, he made up the name when the NASDAQ was still going up and never bothered to update it. There's something slightly scoffing in the main character, already knowing Ari's surprise news that he is engaged. There is the way in which he predicts the telling. Quote, he loves Nessia, he'll say, and look into my eyes. This time, he'll say in his deep and very convincing voice, this time it's real. Both the assertion of its realness and the description of Ari's voice as convincing paradoxically work to undermine its sincerity. The actual performance of the announcement follows the narrator's prediction. Quote, I'm marrying the love of my life, and this time, he dropped in a 2-second pause. This time it's real. Because we already heard about it in the narrative, because it was predicted, it comes off as especially disingenuous. Once the food arrives, the narrator frustrates Ari, seemingly by not enjoying his meal, but also either by not celebrating Ari's news quite enough, or even further beneath the text, because Ari senses a shift in their relationship, a widening gap. Ari takes the initiative as if deciding to break off their friendship before the narrator can do so. He has no patience for the narrator and curses him. Even now, says Ari, even now I know that later on I'll be sorry I said that. And then he shows unexpected insight. Quote, but being sorry about it won't make it any less true. End quote. For the third reading, we need to go back to the menu of the seafood restaurant where the two friends meet to have lunch. The day's specials include red tuna, halibut, and talking fish served raw, lightly salted with lemon. Ari orders the halibut, highly recommended by the waitress, and declares it delicious. The narrator, our protagonist, orders the talking fish. He's disappointed when it lies there silently on his plate. When he calls over the waitress, she explains, quote, the dish is called talking fish as an indication of what kind of fish it is, which in this case is the kind that can talk. But the fact that it can talk doesn't mean that it will at any moment. In fact, after Ari takes off in a huff, the fish does talk. Wikipedia reminds us, and here I quote, talking animals are a common theme in mythology and folktales, as well as children's literature. Fictional talking animals often are anthropomorphic, possessing human-like qualities, but appearing as a creature. The usage of talking animals enables storytellers to combine the basic characteristics of the animal with human behavior, to apply metaphor, and to entertain children. That's from Wikipedia. This is most assuredly not a children's story. The themes and some of the language that I skipped over makes it clear that the intended audience is limited to adult readers. Nor is it myth, folktale, or even a pop culture reference to Billy Bass, if you remember that singing fish on the wall. Instead, the talking fish can give voice to something no one else can. Take off, the fish whispered to me without opening its eyes. Grab a cab to the airport and hop on the first plane out. But I can't just take off like that, the narrator explained in a clear, slow voice. I have commitments here, business. The fish shut up, and so did I. Almost a minute later, it added, never mind, forget it. I'm depressed. That's from toward the end of the story. I'm going to argue that just as the fish's speech serves as an expression of the despair the protagonist feels, his belief in the fish's power of speech represents an abiding optimism. The character's last lines and the very last lines of the story display this optimism. Quote, the fish was good. Really, you have a very nice place here. I personally read the story as a triumph of optimism because there's a fourth way to read the story, as one that engages with the master narrative of Israeli literature, the central concern, the idea and the reality of Zionism. Let's return to the opening lines of the work that you haven't read, but I'm going to give them to you. Quote, ever since I came back to Israel, everything looks different to me. Smelly, sad, dull, end quote. Here we have the beginnings of a story that is possibly post-Zionist, potentially taking a critical or even antithetical position. But if we are careful readers, we linger over the last words of the story and read the meaning behind them. The last sentence declares, here to be a very nice place. If we contrast that, these closing lines, here being a nice place, with the opening lines, we understand a shift in attitude and perspective. And although there may not be hope for the fish, which is, after all, being served in a restaurant, there is hope for the main character, for the place he is in, and for us. When the author himself was asked about the fish's words, he said, wouldn't you be depressed if you were served on a plate to someone who didn't even want to eat you? But he also declared that what makes a writer is that he waits for the fish to speak. And I think what makes us readers is that we listen. Thank you. So I have a dessert, but I thought I would end here and give time for questions.
Okay, so Paula, wherever you are in your box,
Just unmuting myself.
go right
Okay.
ahead.
So can you hear me? Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. So my first question, and then we'll take questions from everyone, but I'm going to use my exalted position here to ask a question that's really come to me from our readings in our group, which is that I may be completely mistaken, and I'm no specialist in literature, either American or English or Israeli. But it seems to me there's a qualitative difference between the writers who wrote more closely to the time of the founding of the state, 1948, and now. That the writing of Shalev and Oz and Yehoshua seems to be really focused on Israel and Zionism and the early days of the Yeshuv. And then the modern books seem more personal. They could almost be American. They don't seem, they're situated in Israel, but they don't necessarily seem to be focused on Israel. Is that characterization at all correct?
Well, I think you do have something there. I think that there is, there's less of a grappling with what does it mean for us to be Zionists, and the generation of Yoshua and Oz were looking at, oh, our fathers were, that they were the pioneers, and then Shalev you know, our fathers were the pioneers. What's left for us to do? How can we be heroes? And dealing with their masculinity and all sorts of things. But you have lots of different things are happening. You have a lot more voices coming in, I think, especially in the 80s and 90s, and opening this up. And then you have a recognition that the personal is part of the story. And so, whereas there were writers in the 80s and 90s being taken to task by some of the great critics and scholars of Hebrew literature and Israeli literature for not writing big national themes, it's definitely accepted now. And yet, even when it's a personal story, it can be read that there's certainly elements that are very Israeli. I mean, I'm thinking if I go to Grossman, and some of you have read To the End of the Land, which is known as the book of the magical thinking book, where the woman leaves home so that her son, her soldier son, she thinks he won't die if she's not there to get the announcement of his death. And it was and became a very personal book for Grossman, but it's also very national. It works on lots of different levels. So it's, you know, that's probably his most personal book in some ways, and yet his most national book.
So yeah, so if you take like Waking Lions, though, even though that's situated in the Negev and it has a lot of feeling of Israel, that what's happening to the characters could happen anywhere. It's very universal.
Yes and no, but it's also asking about what are we doing about our immigrants? How are we dealing with people who are not Jewish? How do we deal with issues of race? Are we a race, you know, oh, we're not a racist society and we're welcoming of immigrants. What are we going to do with our non-Jewish immigrants?
Mhm.
And so, and what about the ethics? What about our Jewish ethics and our Zionist ethics? So in some ways, it's an extremely national book.
But it's a national book with universal themes.
The
That
best
same
are.
issue of racism. I mean,
Well, I think the best books are.
right. So
Right.
I don't see any questions written in the chat. Is that right, or is there something wrong? But who has a question?
You're right. I'm inviting people now to write in the chat or just to unmute themselves.
Right. Well, in the meantime, can I ask one more question, Terry? While
Absolutely. And then I have a
okay. Well, why don't you go ahead? I don't want to hog all of.
I just
Professor
wanted
Berg's
to, you
time.
know, obviously there's major names of Israeli authors that we all sort of know a little bit about, but I was wondering about your opinion and about the people who are writing now, you know, younger writers, and who's up and coming, and where are they taking their inspiration from?
Yeah, well, I think as Paula was suggesting, or maybe how I could have answered this, they're certainly aware of what's going on in the rest of the world, you know, in world literature. And Israelis tend to read much more European literature than Americans do, for example, and much more that has been translated into Hebrew or into, you know, we tend not to read translations as much, Americans in general. But I think they're taking it all different ways. I mean, there's a really thriving gay literature, and there's science fiction, and there, you know, all the different genre literatures that wouldn't have been considered, aren't highbrow or weren't considered highbrow. And anything you can imagine. So, and yet the stalwarts are still, people are still working on the Holocaust as a topic, or the Little Israel of the 1950s, or what it's like to live in a city like Tel Aviv.
I
So
have to-
what is taught in school? Like, what are high school kids? What kind of Israeli literature are they exposed to? Do you know?
So it changes every few years, or every once in a while. They have a, and it depends how many units of literature they're taking and so forth. But there's the canon that they read. There's more of the Mizrahi writers are starting to sneak into the required reading. But I what's interesting to me is, in some ways, the from what I know, the Arab schools teach a much more canonical, or like they teach more Bialik, I think, than the Jewish schools.
really.
So it's interesting. I don't know, I haven't been to Israel for a little while, and I haven't really seen the curricula, but it's interesting to me that there are works that I think of as classical and canonical, and you can't do without, and Israelis who are getting their advanced degrees in literature haven't read them because it's not part of what they think of as the canon anymore.
Can I speak?
Of
Please.
course.
Okay. Is that all right?
Yeah, just who is it? I can't see
Let-
it.
It's Shulamit
Paula-
Reinhardt's.
Yes,
Oh,
right.
hi, Sue.
Hi, Paula. Thank you for arranging all of this, and thank you for the wonderful talk that you just gave. I can answer a little bit the question of what is taught in high schools in Israel. One story that is now, I think, required reading is by Savion Liebrecht, which is called Apples in the Desert.
Right.
And I wanted to mention her because I somehow, I know it's not nice, but I somehow get tired of always hearing of the same olds. And I just think that we should pay more attention to some of the women writers, and some of them are really wild, like Orly Castell Bloom. I don't know if you know some of her works, which are so strange, but yet are rooted in Israel, and require a lot of thought to figure out what she's all about. For example, she wants to be the best possible mother. And so to do that, she slices up her child to make sure, of course, this is science fiction. And
This is a character, though,
yeah,
in
right,
Dolly City.
Dolly City. So she slices up the child to see how everything is, but in the process of doing that, maybe she is killing the child. So that's a kind of an interesting dilemma. In Savion Liebrecht, maybe some of you have read her. Has anyone read her? No, you'd love it, Paula. It's about a religious girl in, I think she's from Mea Shearim in Jerusalem, who gets on a bus to go down to the Negev, which is really a kind of counterpoint to Tel Aviv, and maybe also a counterpoint to Mea Shearim, where the Haredim live, and is in love with a guy. And whatever she was taught is the right behavior for a Jewish girl by her family and her community is the opposite of what she's doing down there. And the interesting thing is not so much that girl, but the relationship between her mother and her, because her mother is very annoyed that she has taken off, and she wants to bring her home. And the more she sees how her daughter is living, the more appealing it becomes. And you almost sense that she would have liked it for herself. So
And I actually read that slightly differently, because I see the mother as being in between, the mediator between the father and the daughter.
I love it that we have different, slightly
Yeah.
different interpretation.
Yeah.
But I like these writers because they take, not in the case of Orly Castel Bloom, but Sigalit Landau for sure, takes people that could be you, takes Israelis, all different kinds of Israelis, and puts them in moral conundra. Like a woman Israeli who gets some Arab person to renovate her apartment and gets the hots for him. How should that be resolved, etc. So I kind of, like Paul or somebody said, that the stories that are universal and specific to Israel, I think, are the most successful. And the stories that deal, I think, with realism are really very, very good. I think that Edgar Carrot is interesting, but I think it's a little obscure. And I don't know if that may be a reason that he's not taught, or but maybe he is taught in high schools, but I haven't heard that he is.
I don't know if he's taught in high schools. I don't know that he has to be because I think he's so well known.
Yeah, right.
But I regularly teach Orly Castelblum and Savion Liebrecht and some of the newer ones. But I find that Edgar Keret is very successful to teach to students of Hebrew, advanced students of Hebrew. There's
I'm not really interested in putting down Edgar Carrot.
right. No, I understand. I
I'm
understand, but I'm
interested-
just, I think he's so charming. There's something about when you hear him read his stories, whether it's in English or in Hebrew, and if you're interested, This American Life has plenty of them because Ira Glass seems to love him, but they come to life when he reads them.
I'm sure. I'm
Right.
sure.
And so there are writers such as Michal Govrin,
Right.
who is not as accessible, I think. I think she can be very difficult I always think of students, right? Can my students understand her? What do I have to do to get them to be able to read it? Not necessarily read it the way I do, but find their way in and make meaning. And she's very spiritual.
We have a question here from Andrew Oram. Andrew, do you want to read your question or ask your question?
I just wanted to mention that I benefited a lot from a book that Robert Alter put out back around 1970, I think. So he called it, I think, Modern Hebrew Literature, but this is 1970, and he was reaching back even further.
Right.
I thought it was a useful.
It's a very nice collection. It really is. Yeah. There are many more since then, but it's really lovely. Yeah.
Do you think there's a future for Hebrew in America, Hebrew learning?
Well, that's kind of what we have what we discuss in our book, what we talk about when we talk about Hebrew and what it means to Americans.
Okay,
so I think you'll find different answers depending on which essay you're reading.
Yeah, I would like, if you don't mind, I remember a while back, there was a discussion about what makes a Jewish book Jewish. And I would like for you to really sharpen that angle about what makes Israeli literature Israeli. And you mentioned it at the beginning, it's not only the Hebrew, it's not only this, it's not only that. But does an Israeli author who sits in Canada or United States abroad and writes in a foreign language considered an Israeli literature, in your opinion?
So that's a really good question, because there's one issue, an Israeli who writes in Hebrew, but not in Israel, like Ruby Namdar. He got the Sapir Prize, and then they changed the rules of the Sapir Prize, so nobody outside of Israel can get it. It was very controversial, and at one of my conferences, there was a huge blow up between Ruby Namdar and some of the audience, Israelis who were sitting in Israel. That's him. And then you have, for example, Boyanju, who wrote The People of Forever Are Not Afraid. I don't know how many of you have read that.
Right.
I don't know if Shulamit has read it.
I have
but-
not.
Okay, so this was written in English by a native speaker of Hebrew. And yet it is so in, and while she was sitting at Harvard, she was an undergraduate, that's where she started it. It is so Israeli. It is so steeped in Israeliness because it's struggling with it's three girls who live in a border town. They go through army service, bad things happen. There's violence and trauma and how they deal with it. I'm not selling it very well, am I? It's really fascinating, but I think it's a difficult read. I know that because of what happens, but my students have loved it. And not because it's easy or just because these are people, characters their age and they can relate to, but in part because they can't relate to them because of the experience of serving in the army, because of the experience of being in this border town that nothing seems to happen.
Okay, so you're saying that a theme
So I
is-
think that
is making an Israeli,
I think that
literature Israeli.
I can't see that not as Israeli. I think that's a very Israeli novel.
Have you read any of the work of Ayelet Sabah, the recent work
Yeah,
of Ayelet Sabah?
yeah.
What do you
So most people are looking at Ayelet Sabari's work as Israeli, and you know it does start questioning on the edges. I also, you know, the what is Jewish literature is a question that I've grappled with also in a course I teach, and then I come up with one answer. But it is a question: what is Israeli literature? Hebrew is not, it doesn't have to be written in Hebrew. It doesn't have to be written in Israel. It doesn't have to be written by a Jew, but it has to be something, there has to be something to it that makes it Israeli. And I'm not sure that we have quite, because we're just, you know, the writers and us scholars following the writers and readers following the writers are just now dealing with a sizable number, or at least a critical mass of writers who are writing outside of Israel, a critical mass of non-Jewish writers writing in Hebrew. And so it's new.
And what about Israeli Palestinians who are publishing their books now in the Arab world because they want a shelf life for their books? And and then printing a small edition in Israel through the Israeli publisher publishing. Is that an Israeli literature?
Can you give me an example of who you're?
I wish I remember his name. It's a recent book, a recent author who chose to publish his book. One of the criticism about Sayed Kashua, everybody knows Sayed Kashua? Yes, no? Sayed Kashua was an Israeli Haaretz writer who recently moved to the United States because of his inner conflict about coexistence in Israel. He is a very good friend of Edgar Keret. When he was criticized by a Harvard student about his literature that not being known to his own people, he said he was unable to publish it in Israel in Arabic, which is not true because we have Arabic books that we are studying from in the Israeli educational system. Of course, there are print houses.
No,
that he
but
was able
that's not why he said he couldn't.
He couldn't because he wouldn't have had a shelf in the Arab world. That's why he didn't do it. He was unable to do it. So there is a new author, and I wish I'd remember his name, who was recently interviewed on an Israeli TV program, who published his book in Arabic in Jordan. He published it in Jordan with a Jordanian publisher house. And I wonder, of course, I wish I would have been able to read it, but I wonder if it makes it in Israeli literature.
Well, and I think that we, at that point, I would probably defer to the author about how he would want to define it and how he would define himself, because there are Palestinian citizens of Israel who would consider themselves Israeli, and Palestinian citizens of Israel who would not. And it's a contentious, this identity and definitions is really difficult when you get to that. But I think, Anton Shamas did not want arabesques translated into Arabic. So I don't know the Harvard student who was criticizing Saeed Kashua, and I don't know that we know better than Saeed why he why he does this and not that. But it's not always easy for writers to get published in the language they want in the place they want.
We have other
because
questions.
it's not because it's illegal or nobody will, but just because you want to publish a book doesn't mean a publisher says, sure, I'll do it. So it gets complicated.
Do we have other questions? I don't see any more in the chat.
Andrew Orm wrote, what about the need to know the Bible to read Israeli Jewish authors?
Okay, I don't see that, but great. What about it?
Is that a suggestion for a criterion, or? Yeah, kind of. Like, it seems to separate a lot, maybe not all of them, but a lot of them. If you don't get the references, you can't get the of course, I'm sure that's true of any literature to some extent. There's background you need. There are actually some contemporary writers who are very careful not to have allusions, who try to avoid the elusive, what's considered the elusive burden of Hebrew. But you're right.
So many of the earlier writers, that was, there was so many references that if you didn't know the references, you couldn't understand the book, right?
You're talking about Agnon, right?
Yeah, specifically, yeah. It's sort of like, when you read the Torah and there's explanations right on the sides. So Oz's poems also are loaded.
They're multi-layered, yeah. They're not only the Bible, but some authors are folding in other pieces of literature.
But I think even Agnon, if you read his stories, even if you don't know, you can't appreciate you can appreciate him on one level where, oh, he's using Mishneh Hebrew here and he's using this here and he's weaving it in, and oh, it's so beautiful. On one hand, great. But on the other hand, when he writes about a couple who are getting a divorce, for example, and the silences between them, that's something you can read without getting all of the references. It's a great story because it works on different levels. So, and I agree with Shulamit about Ronit Matalon, a great loss to Hebrew letters when she passed away. And The Bride Closed the Door is a great novella.
Available in English.
Yeah.
Wonderful book.
So what would you recommend for our book group?
Well, I think if you didn't like Marmani, or you found that dense, that you might want sort of a guide with her other books, but I would start with "and the bride closed the door."
You would?
Yeah.
Easily obtained, very short and very funny. And poignant,
Yeah, moving.
and deals with gender. I mean, you're a group of, maybe not all of you are women in the Hebrew group or the literature group, but
But
it's
all of you
nice.
have gender.
What?
But all of you have gender.
We do. But it's fun to have it in either case, either all women, all men, or both, and to feel free to discuss what are the gender relations here. I'm going to sign out. I don't know what time this is ending.
We're going to end soon.
But are you going to
Paula,
give
why
us
don't you-
dessert?
What?
I'll give you dessert another time.
There you go.
Okay, I think it's time to wrap up. Yes?
I have one more suggestion. Do you know Yael Katsir's book about,
Yehudit Katsir?
that's what I meant, Yehudit Katsir. There's a filmmaker, Yael Katsir. You know the one I mean, about where
Closing the Sea?
where a female student is in love with her female teacher?
Um,
It was translated into English.
Not coming to me. Sorry.
Fantastic book.
Well, when you think of the name, let us know.
Well, it also has the name Anne or Anna in it, because she's also in love with Anne Frank.
Ah,
But it's a contemporary girl.
Right.
You know what I mean, right?
Yep. Yep. Yeah, she's also an interesting writer.
It's Judith Katsir. I have it here in my library. Dearest Anne, in
Right.
English.
great. All
There's so
right.
much good literature. We're not only the people of the book, we're the people of the pen.
Well, it sounds like you have a good resource there too. So,
Okay.
but
Thank you very much. This was
All right.
great.
We want to thank you, Nancy, for everything. So much.
thank you all.
Great.
Thank you for dealing with my fishtails.
We appreciated it. And thank you all for coming, and see you next time. Okay.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Erev Tov.
Okay.